I was reading through the college catalog for a local area junior college, and as I read through it, I realized that they offered some high school classes. And I was very curious about this, so I called the college and asked some advisor lady if you could go to high school through the junior college. And she said no, that you could only take classes at the junior college that you honestly could not get into at the high school, right? Either by some, you know, some scheduling conflict, or if there just were not enough spaces open in the high school. That only in like circumstances where you could not get into anyway in the high school, only then could you go to the junior college. And the junior college was meant to be, spillover, not as a primary form of high school going through. And I'm not sure if this is correct, but this probably isn't too far off. In high school in California, you need to take 4 years of English and history, 2 years of math and electives, and 3 years of science. Now, what you could do is take English, history, and science in semester 1, English during January, English, history, and math in semester 2, English and history during the summer, history, science, and an elective during semester 3, an elective during the next January, and science and math during semester 4, and you will be done with high school in 2 years, and in all likelihood having gone through a lot less of the humiliating crap, and probably spending less time during those 2 years than you would spend in 2 years in high school. Because remember, it's the college thing, the 3 days a week, and you go in, 4 hours a day, maybe if you're taking a full load, as opposed to the 7 hours a day in high school, plus whatever extracurriculars you want to do to get into a good college at a later date. Now, why would the state education system want everyone to spend 4 years in school instead of 2? Certainly it would save the taxpayer a lot of money to have everyone go in 2, and it would provide a lot more flexibility for the student. Well, just keep in mind that organizations will inevitably fight to survive and grow. And where there is no state, the way you survive and grow is by making stuff people will buy. And you can earn profits that way, and then you can build your organization by selling stuff that people value, right? That is, you add value to resources so that you can sell. You take in a bunch of resources for $10, and by adding value to it through your labor, you sell it for $15, and that $5 is the additional value that you provided to all these resources, which is to say that's the additional value you provided to society minus consumer surplus. Now, where there is a state, the way you grow your organization is by lobbying the state to get subsidy and grants of monopoly privilege, or just sometimes outright control. Like you get the state to directly control educational services and then put the existing leaders of the educational services at the head of this new government bureau or department, right? Or like the Bureau of Education or the Department of Education or whatever. But the broader point is that any reform of the education system will be exceedingly difficult because the people who make a living are wedded to the current system, and they will use whatever state apparatuses, be they local, state, or federal, they will use the laws to fight any effort to allow choice or efficiency. They will go to the wall to maintain their parasitical position, and they'll spin tall tales about it all being good for the children. The average tuition for private schools is about $3,116 per year, and this is from 2008. Versus $6,587 per year for state schools. Right, private schools are spend less money per student. Now, private schools are of course hogtied to state curriculums. So while you do see leaps in economic efficiency, right, as you expect from a firm that has to, from a private firm, there's only so much you can do to make the existing 4-year system better. So it's really not that much of a leap at all to assume that a pure private education system would be less than 1/4 the cost of the state school system, given that it would only take 2 years, right? I expect it would be a lot more like the college system. Also keep in mind that you still pay taxes even if you send your child to a private school. And so private schools tend toward more, they tend to have more upper class parents than state schools. Not always, but they tend to have more upper class parents than state schools. And thus, if you did away with state schools completely, you would most likely see the per year private school tuition being less than what it currently is, right? Along with the school, of course, only being for 2 years long. Because the students going to private schools now are from parents willing to spend more money on schooling. And this comes from some mixture of valuing schooling and having the money to spend on schooling. If all students were going to private schools, then the private schools would be catering to a broader demographic, and this would include a lot of people who don't value schooling as much. And so the current private school system is catered to people who tend to value schooling a lot. But if all was private, then you would have private schools that would cater to people who don't value schooling as much, right? And so they wouldn't, and so these students wouldn't get the deluxe package, so to speak. Now, the private schools are actually cheaper and better than the state schools, but it's more expensive to send kids to private schools because you're paying for the state schools even if you aren't using them, right? Just because you send your kids to a private school doesn't mean you get to opt out of the taxes. And so the state schools are free to use. And of course, the arguments that apply to high school also apply to college. Without a state, it is my opinion that four-year college would no longer be the norm, but an exception for the very wealthy. Because this is because only universities with state funding can compete nowadays, except for a few oddball universities. I think there's one in Pennsylvania that I forget. It was some ultra-religious school in Pennsylvania that opted out of getting state funding so they could keep whatever it is they wanted to keep. And thus the state can decide to pull accreditation and funding from any school at once. Right? And so if a university just up and said, forget all this general education bullshit, and we'll give you a degree in 2 years, they would immediately lose their state funding, and of course half of their staff would be fired, and so they wouldn't receive as much in tuition, although they would certainly charge more per year, right? Because the general education classes are a little bit cheaper to do. Like the schools tend to make profit off of the freshmen, and they lose money on the graduate students because the graduate students are getting more intensive education. They're getting more teacher time and smaller classrooms, right? The first few years in college, the freshmen are packed into these auditoriums where there's one teacher, and so they make a whole lot of money off of the first few years, and then they pour money and they lose money off of the graduate students. And so, but if all you have is like, intensive upper level coursework, then the school is going to have to raise tuition. Right? And so even if they could pull it off, why would they want to? Why would a school want to do something like this? So that their staff and student body could be half in size, so they would no longer. And if they want to, engage in intercollegiate sports, well, goodbye to that. So they would have smaller profit margins as a result of not having as much, or perhaps none at all, state funding. So they have a very good reason to keep their cozy state protections. But just imagine, kids will be done with high school by age 16, and then will have 2 years to either go to college or get ready for college. And if they go to college, will only have to go for 2 years. And the smartest kids could routinely graduate by age 17, which brings us to the next topic, the underclass. Given that a pure private high school experience will cost less than a quarter of the public experience, it's nearly impossible that the underclass will on net suffer. And the reason is that poor people are paying for public education anyway, even if they pay zero taxes, because their employer pays taxes. Right? And the cost of schools gets taken out of their paycheck. Or, well, I don't want to go into anything else, but let's just leave it at that. Any tax increase results in a mixture of lower profits and lower wages. And the employer will pay some of the tax with his profits, and some of it will come from the wage cuts. And so the poor people are paying some of the taxes for quote-unquote free services. So now, even if the poor were somehow saddled with 100% of the cost of their schooling on a true free market, that is, there were no scholarships, that if that these schools that are now no longer having to pay any taxes would not increase the number of scholarships they were giving out, even though the schooling would now be drastically cheaper. Even if somehow the poor were saddled with 100% of the cost of their schooling, and the poor, I know, is kind of vague, but let's just say that the poor, whatever they may be, are saddled with 100% of the cost of their schooling on a true free market, High school is now only 2 years and about $10,000 if you factor in all the miscellaneous expenses, school supplies and stuff. So compared to the state system, the poor kid now has 2 extra years. They graduate when they're 60. Now they have 17 and 18, 2 extra years to earn $10,000 plus interest. If he can do so, then the moment he has paid off the debt is the moment that the poor family has achieved all the net benefit that a state education would have provided, and probably more because the kid now has work experience and can earn higher wages because of it. And they probably receive some charity or financial aid, and the fact that there are no school taxes means that wages are higher. And so what you get is this whole nexus of positive effects. Imagine a state in which everyone was given a golden toilet seat at age 18, paid for by tax dollars. If some libertarian whippersnapper started yammering about a stateless society, some statists may say, but in a stateless society, if you could even call it that, who would provide everyone a golden toilet seat at age 18? And the answer, of course, is that nobody would. And the fact is that any state program is, to an extent, just a golden toilet seat. And when folks blather about education in a stateless society, they're asking for something far more absurd than a golden toilet seat at age 18. They're asking for 12 years of compelled schooling, and the current educational system is based on the Prussian philosophy that children are bad and don't like to learn and have to be forced to learn. Technologically speaking, this is all irrelevant. Lessons can be put in media formats, tutoring rooms work just fine, and tests can be administered like the SAT, where students pass through the grades that way. That this would be orders of magnitude cheaper and solve so many headaches should be apparent. And if a student can't be bothered to learn things, that's fine. The world needs ditch diggers too. What's more is that educating stupid people results in stupid people thinking they're educated, especially if they got better grades than the smart people. And this, of course, leads to sanctimony and faith in official titles, of which grades are one. Anyway, when people ask how the current mode of schooling will be maintained in a stateless society, the answer is that it won't, and good riddance. I have no crystal ball, but in a stateless society, I can see most people finishing schooling at age 14 to 16, and then getting a job or traveling or doing something worthwhile. Some people will want to become engineers, doctors, or some sort of professional, and they will then probably have to spend more time learning. If someone wants the toxic socializing of the high school experience, then they are free to pay $3,000 a year to send their kids to a gulag where they have their minds systematically destroyed. I say around $3,000 a semester because that's how much private schools cost on average in 2008, and state schools cost around $6,000, but they are funded by tax dollars. And remember, that $3,000 is for the whole Prussian deal. Right, with a building, a teacher in front, and all the various extracurriculars. Now, what about the poor? Well, first, I think downloading free audio lessons from the internet is a lot cheaper than the financial cost of free public education. And tutoring, which would be necessary for any significant depth of learning, would emerge on the market. Probably a bunch of former teachers would become tutors. We can see this with SAT tutoring, and I can see tutoring classes popping up, which aren't really classes, or perhaps have brief lessons, with most of the time spent answering questions. Now, if a family is so destitute that they cannot afford this, yet their child demonstrates ability and desire to learn something, well, then this is prime scholarship material. And this is I simply view this as a welfare issue. Poor person needs money, in this case for education services. Charity evaluates financial situation of poor person, then provides money. I'm not interested in specific welfare services and view medical service welfare and educational service welfare as statist inventions designed to create cartels and justify state control of certain sectors of the economy. Just give the poor people their money, all right, and they'll spend it according to their subjective demands, not what a politician wants to subsidize and control in their name.